All right, guys. So my Thursday reading did not post. It was too long. It was like 20 minutes long. So we're going to redo it for today. Happy Monday. We are starting off on chapter 4, House of the Clock and its Walls. So it was the last week of October, and Tarby's arm had almost healed. Lewis saw less and less of him now. He still waited for him on the baseball diamond out behind the school, and sometimes Tarby showed up, and sometimes he didn't. Of course, Tarby couldn't be expected to be very interested in flies and grounders at this time of year. The football season was getting underway. Lewis had seen Tarby playing football with the other boys after school. Needless to say, Tarby was always the quarterback. He threw long passes and made end runs and pulled off tricky plays like the Statue of Liberty. Lewis had thought of trying to join the football team. But he remembered what happened back in Wisconsin. Whenever anyone charged over the line at him, he fell to the ground and covered his head with his hands. He couldn't pass, and he couldn't catch passes, and if he tried to kick the ball, he usually wound up bunting it with his knee. Maybe if he got really good at baseball, he could get Tarby to teach him football next year. But he wasn't going to learn much about baseball without Tarby. Of course, these days he wasn't learning much even with Tarby's help. On those rare occasions when Tarby showed up to play ball with Lewis, he seemed to want to get the game over with in a hurry. Lewis knew what he was losing, that he was losing Tarby, but so far he hadn't figured out how in the world he was going to hang on to him. On Saturday afternoon, when the two of them were poking around the cemetery, Lewis had an idea. New Zebedee's beautiful old cemetery was on a high hill just outside of town. It was full of elaborate gravestones that showed weeping women leaning on urns and cupids extinguishing torches. There were pillars made to look as if they had been broken, and there was pillars with hands on top pointing up. There were little tombstones made in the shape of lambs, and those were over the graves of children. Some of the lambs had been there so long that they were worn into grimy white blobs that reminded Lewis of soap. On this particular day, Lewis and Tarby had been inspecting a lot where all the gravestones were carved to look like wood. Each gravestone was marked by a little granite log, complete with bark and rings and knot holes. The curb around the lot matched the tombstones, and in the center of everything rose a broken tree of stone. The top was jagged as if lightning had struck it, and the stone woodpecker was whetting his beak on the realistically carved bark. Lewis and Tarby had been playing in this petrified forest for a while, but now they were getting tired. The sun, red as the tomato sun in Jonathan's stained glass window, was setting between two crooked pine trees. Lewis shivered and zipped up his jacket. "Let's go back to my house," he said. "Mrs. Zimmerman can make us some cocoa, and I'll show you some real petrified wood. My uncle got it from a forest out west that was actually turned into stone." Tarby looked bored, and he also looked mean. "Who wants to go back to your old uncle's house? It's a pretty crazy place if you ask me. And how come old Mrs. Zimmerman is over there all the time? Is she in love with him?" Tarby threw his arms around the stone tree and started kissing it with loud smacks. Lewis felt like crying, but somehow he managed to keep down the tears. I bet you think all my uncle can do is the eclipse the moon," said Lewis. It sounded silly, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. Tarby looked interested, in a bored sort of way. "Well," he said, "what else can he do?" Lewis did not know why he said what he said next. It just came to him. "My uncle can raise the dead." Tarby did a somersault over one of the log-shaped markers. "Oh, sure he can," he snorted. "Look, your uncle's fake. That night when he made it look like the moon had gone out and all that other stuff was happening, he had just hypnotized us. My dad told me that was probably what happened." Lewis stared at him. "You said you'd never tell anybody about that night, remember? I made you promise." Tarby looked away. "Oh, yeah, I guess I did promise. Sorry." Both of them sat quietly for a long while. There was nothing left of the sun but a faint red afterglow. A night wind had sprung up, and it stirred the long grass on the graves. Finally, Lewis got up and spoke. His voice came from way down in his throat. "What if I were to raise the dead by myself?" Tarby looked at him. He giggled. "Boy, that would be some fun. I could see you running down Main Street in the middle of the night with a ghost after you." Tarby got up and waved his arms. "Woo!" he wailed. "I'm the ghost of the mystery. Woo!" Lewis's face was getting red. "Want to see me do it?" "Yeah," said Tarby. "I do. When are you going to do it?" I'll let you know, said Lewis, although he didn't have the faintest idea of what he was going to do or when he was going to do it or how he was going to do it. All he knew is that he had to try if he was going to hang on to his only friend in New Zebedee. During the week before Halloween, Lewis spent a lot of time in his uncle's study. Normally, it was okay for Lewis to browse in the library, but if Jonathan had known what books Lewis was looking at now, he would have stopped him. Lewis knew this, so he always waited till Jonathan was out visiting or raking leaves or tying up corn shocks in the garden. When he was sure he would not be disturbed, Lewis would slide back the paneled walnut doors, tiptoe into the study, and roll the stepladder down the section of the library that contained Jonathan's magic books. Jonathan had forbidden Lewis to look through these books without permission. So Lewis felt very bad about what he was doing. He felt bad about the whole business, but he went about it anyway. He looked through all the strange volumes with their pentacles and pentagrams and anagrams and talismans and abracadabras and long incantations printed in old English lettering. But he spent most of his time with the big black leather volume entitled Necromancy. Necromancy is the branch of magic that deals with raising of the dead. The front piece of the book was an engraving that showed Dr. John Dee, personal astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I of England, as he and his assistant, Michael Kelly, raised the spirit of the dead woman in an English churchyard at midnight. The two men were standing inside a chalk circle drawn on the ground. The border of the circle was covered with strange symbols and words. Just outside of the charmed circle, however, a figure in a long nightgown hovered over them. On her head, she wore an odd, ruffy bonnet, the kind that they once buried women in. Lewis kept turning back to the illustration because it frightened him, but he read the rest of the book. He read it all, and he memorized some of the charms. He even copied one of the pentagrams and the spell that went with it into a piece of paper, a piece of notepaper, and put it into his pocket. Halloween was a windy, dark day. Lewis sat in the window of his bedroom and watched the wind strip the trees of a few ragged brown leaves that remained. He felt sad and scared. He was sad because he had disobeyed his uncle, who was always so kind to him, and he felt scared because he had promised Harvey that he would meet him in the graveyard at 12 o'clock on Halloween night, so that the two of them could raise up the spirits of the dead person, or at least try to. Lewis didn't think it would work, and he was kind of hoping that it wouldn't. They had the grave all picked out. It was the mausoleum stuck into the side of the hill the graveyard was built on. Lewis did not know anything about who was buried in the tomb, and neither did Tarby. There wasn't even a name on the door, but whatever the name was, it probably started with an O, because there was an O in the triangle over the heavy stone arc. It was a funny kind of O, and it looked like this. At dinner that night, Lewis did not say much. This was odd because he usually talked his head off about everything under the sun, especially those things he didn't know anything about. Jonathan asked him if he was all right, and Lewis said, of course he was all right. Anybody could see that. Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman exchanged worried glances and stared at him again, but Lewis went on eating with his head down. At the end of the meal, he pushed his chair back and announced that he was not going trick-or-treating because he was too old for it. Does that mean that you're not coming over to my place for cider and donuts? Mrs. Zimmerman asked. Because if it does, I'll show up at midnight on the foot of your bed in my role of grinning Griselda and the resuscitated cadaver. Sorry. It's a horrible thing to see. Lewis looked up. There was a wild look in his face, but he managed to force his mouth into a smile. No, Mrs. Zimmerman, he said, I wouldn't miss one of your cider and donut parties. Not for the world. But right now, I've got to go up to my room and finish one of John Stoddard's books. I've gotten to the exciting part, whereupon he jumped up, excused himself, and then he ran upstairs. Jonathan looked at Mrs. Zimmerman. I have a feeling, he said. Something's up. Hooray for your lightning-quick mind, said Mrs. Zimmerman. Yes, something is up, and I have a feeling that we won't know about it until it's over with. Maybe not, said Jonathan, and he lit his pipe. But I can't believe that Lewis is mixed up in anything bad. And I'm certainly not going to grill him like a mean stepfather, but still I'd like to know what he's up to. So would I, said Mrs. Zimmerman thoughtfully. Do you suppose it has anything to do with Tarby? The boy's arm is healing, and he'll probably go back to play with the other boys. That leaves Lewis out. Jonathan scratched his chin. Yes, maybe that's it. He said, I'll have to have a talk with him. Oh, by the way, have you noticed that clock is louder? He was trying to sound nonchalant, but Mrs. Zimmerman could read the look in his eyes. Yes, she said, trying hard to smile. I've heard it too, and maybe if we ignore it, it'll just die down. It has before, you know. One thing for sure, you're not going to do any good by barging around the house with a crowbar, prying open the wood and peering in between the floorboards. Suppose not, said Jonathan, sighing, though I might come across the blasted thing by sheer persistence. On the other hand, that would mean wrecking the house, and I'm not quite ready to do that. Not until I have some clear idea that the clock is something that can do us harm. And so far, I'm just guessing. I'm not even guessing when I say it's real, physical clock, or I'm even guessing when I say it's a real physical clock, and I'm not just some illusion left here by old Isaac Izard to drive people mad. It's best not to think about that thing, said Mrs. Zimmerman, not until you have to, at any rate. You can't prepare for all the disasters that might occur in this frightening world of ours. If the devil appears, or if we find the end of the world is at hand, we'll do something. Well, hide in the cellar. Come on, let's wash the dishes. Lewis came down from his room at 10 o'clock and went to next door to have cider and donuts. He found Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman waiting for him in the dining room. There was a big round oak table at one end of the long room, and it was covered with a clean checkered tablecloth. On the table stood a gallon jug of cider and a plate of powdered donuts, or fried cakes, as Mrs. Zimmerman called them. At the other end of the room, a violet firecracker crackled in the fireplace. Purple shadows rushed back and forth over the rug and over the mantelpiece, and the purple dragon in the painting seemed to wither and squirm. He looked very fierce indeed, and I'm going to stop there because otherwise if I go into more of the chapter, we are going to end up too deep like last time. So I want it to be able to load. So we are stopping on page 72. We'll pick up tomorrow where we left off today. Leave a comment. Let us know that you are listening. So let us know like the interesting fact or question or just a comment in general about what you just heard. All right. See you tomorrow, guys.